the rocks down the river, and they eventually amalgamate at these high energy parts of the river further down the river. So my question is, there's all sorts of ecological reasons why you shouldn't be allowed to harvest gravel from the river, from the Motueka River, but what would happen if you just extracted gravel from the bottom 1 kilometre? So if you extrapolate it further out to the mouth of the river, where the delta, where the flow, the energy reduces, the finer sediment gets dispersed in a fan-like area out towards the sea, And as that builds up, historically, that's how a river changes direction and starts depositing sediment in another part of the delta. So at the moment, obviously over the decades since we've had stop banks on the river, that there's now a build-up of smaller sediment further out to sea as the energy decreases, which is causing a back pressure against the river. But I mean, I'd love to know what the effects are extracting gravel at the bottom of the river. How much pressure would that ease the flow further back? Does anyone know? Has anyone had experience of that?
No, I mean, I'm only sort of guessing, but I always thought that if you made the channel deeper, you'd get a faster flow as well. So I'm not sure how those impacts would pan out as well. So you maybe get more erosion or more erosion along the banks, but maybe it continues to starts picking up bigger particles because it's going faster.
Well, our mitigation to date has been to build the banks higher.
Yeah.
So I because I'm from the government, so I'm not allowed to have an opinion really, but if we forget about the fact that I've been working for them for 3 years and I've got a lot of grey hair, when I was a young fella, we had catchment boards and rabbit boards and all that sort of stuff dealing with our pests and things, and so they were continually extrapolating, taking gravel out of rivers in the Canterbury Plains, right? And then in 1990, 92, I think it was, when the RMA came in, that sort of put pay to a lot of that stuff. And now we've had 30 years of no gravel extraction. And the rivers in Canterbury are exactly the same as you've just talked about, Mike, where the levels in some places are bloody near higher than the stock bank further down the stream. And so that's one of the challenges. And I can't comment on, Norman, on your comment about the speed and that, but I know that was a way of keeping things effectively where they were supposed to be. But since it stopped, and now we've had 30 years of it building up again, it's almost getting to the point that, I don't know what they're going to do, because these events are getting huge. That's obviously Simon Langley, not the government speaking. Over.
No, I mean, it was also
it's been recorded. This could be the end of me. Oh.
Yeah, no, because the observation, interestingly, with some of the aerial footage, is that the river now looks like the braided river that it used to be before it was modified when it was in flood. So I thought that was quite an interesting view, because when that first report I did on the Motueka catchment, and I didn't realise that historically. I mean, I knew it was a floodplain and all the rest, but I didn't realise that the Motueka River was actually a braided river. So looking at that aerial footage, that it looks exactly probably the same as it would have. So
and I heard
is the land use appropriate for for the location.
Well, and that is the dilemma. I heard one prominent horticultural person in our area saying they should just let it go, let it follow its natural course, which is, of course, how the delta, the floodplain, that's how it was made. That's how the best horticultural soil in the country was made over time, was developed over time, was water flows in the least line of resistance. When the sediment builds up, it then changes location to somewhere else, which is the least line of resistance. As you say, this braided effect. And that's how the Waimea Plains and the Motueka Plains, that's how they've been formed. And we've changed all that when, I don't know, stop banks have been there nearly 100 years now. So we've completely changed the ecology and the wetland environment, if you like, of the delta. And So as I understand it, at the moment, why they don't dredge gravels is because of the ecology. The trout, which are an introduced species anyway. But yeah, we've changed the environment so much anyway, and now I think there's an argument saying we can't be hands off. We've got to keep on managing it. There's also someone mentioned to me when this was brought up before that, and I don't know if this is true or not, I just hearsay, that for cultural reasons the water shouldn't be touched. Iwi had some objections, which I can imagine they may have. I don't know how accurate that is. But so there's all these implications that all these other factors that you have to consider before you manipulate it. And I can see why council have sort of had the hands-off approach. And quite frankly, the easiest way to mitigate it is to make the banks taller. I get that, but you can't keep making the banks taller forever. So it's going to be very interesting to see where we go from here.
Also, I guess we've got to look at where the sediment comes from and how that land has been managed up the catchment and the higher parts of the catchment, and what how much bare ground there is, or what land is too susceptible to those sort of slips and loss of sediment, and maybe they need to be planted. I can say this because I work for Horde NZ, not not the pastoral ones further up the catchment. But it's got to think about that as well. Sort of minimising that sort of loss of sediment from further up the catchment.
Mm. Yeah, when you saw my pictures last time, coming from pasture with the sediment runoff was huge. I'd love to see the numbers on forestry. Everything seems pretty quiet in that camp.
Yeah, there's been some major losses from forestry, isn't there?
Okay, shall we start the presentation proper? I'll just share my screen. Did everyone see that?
No.
Nope.
Oh, did I not? Oh, I didn't push the right button again. You see that?
Nope.
Can't see the presentation.
No, nothing there.
Oh.
Are you pressing the share button next to? Oh, you got it.
There we go.
There you go. Always doing something wrong. Right, so this is session 3, and this is around mitigation and management of fresh water and those risks that we've talked about before. Much of this we covered this on session 1. But it's all about discussion and any questions or anything you can add to my comments. So please, I don't want to be talking all afternoon. So let's add to the discussion. Anything that you want to bring up or talk about, please jump in. Right, land management units. We talked about this at session 1. So a land management unit is generally related to a soil type, where if a property has various soil types, it can be carved up into land management units by soil type, by aspect and topography, or by crop. For instance, area A here is an ash soil, volcanic ash soil, and that's good reason. It's significantly different from B, which is a peat soil, and it would have considerable different management plan around nutrients. For example, a peat soil compared to an ash soil, or soils that we have, we call them sedimentary soils. It would be completely different sort of nutrient management. Now, within that a area, there might be two different crops. Maybe you're growing maybe half of it's just grass and the other half is in, I don't know, kiwi fruit or something. So there would be another reason to carve it up again to two different LMUs, land management units. Or in the case of, I'll talk further down the line where we talk about individual block nutrient management in individual blocks within an apple enterprise, where there are different varieties or different age of trees, and they're virtually managed as different land management units or sub-blocks. Right. When we talk about nutrient planning, in a few decades ago, we would just be putting on a couple of 100 kilos of some fertilizer product every year, and that was it. Job done and dusted. But nowadays, we take a whole load of other factors into consideration before we apply any nutrients into the environment. It's a completely different landscape to what it used to be. So we'll look at those LMUs, and what are the risk factors of the area that we're going to apply nutrient to? What's the topography? What climate are we dealing with? Soil type? What are the objectives for the block? If it's perhaps it's a block of carrots on a soil type and a block that we know historically has high yields, is capable of quite high yields. So we will be applying fertilizer, particularly nitrogen, to match those high yields. It's no good applying a high rate of fertilizer if it's a block that we know only gets medium or low yields. We know that we would be applying too much, or the plants can't utilize the higher level of nutrient that perhaps we might apply to a high yielding block. So we take all those things into consideration, and more we need qualified people to help us make those decisions, and certainly that's something we're lacking in New Zealand. Is certainly around nutrient management is enough trained people to consider all these factors and to do a good job. Then we've got things like market regulations and requirements. What does the market want? Is that something that we should be considering as well? So now we've got a whole, on the right here, I won't go through it all now, but we've got a whole planning process around applying nutrients. You can look at this at a later date, but it's pretty much covering what I've just described. And also, we should be referring to the Fruit Association Code of Nutrient Management Practice. And that is currently being rewritten and should be out soon, and it'll be quite a useful document. So the basis of all nutrient management decisions really is soil testing. Now we've got here soil tests carried out annually for best practice, and generally on high value horticultural crops we would do that. We virtually soil test every year. But if you've got a permanent crop, unlike vegetables, say a permanent crop of kiwi fruit, apples, whatever, once you get to a stage of equilibrium, theoretically it's not super important to do it every year, because once you're in equilibrium, you know how much maintenance fertilizer to apply, and you're very confident in what you're doing and how the block is responding. You technically could go out to 2 or 3 years between soil sampling. But as I say, because blocks are horticultural crops are such high value, we do tend to do them each year. So we break it down and test each land management unit, and in the case of most horticultural crops, that is a block. Maybe it's a block of gold kiwi fruit or green or Hayward kiwi fruit. We tend to define a block by the variety. If it's we could have 2 blocks side by side on the same soil type, but different varieties, we would tend to treat them as individual blocks or land management units. Soil pH, as I've said before, plants do not care what the soil pH is, which is the acidity of the soil. pH is really important for nutrient availability. a low or high pH, we can have less solubility of those nutrients and less availability for plants. When we tend to get a high pH, some of the micronutrients, in fact, can become toxic to plants. So, and well, I'm mainly talking about nutrients other than nitrogen at the moment. So the main test for phosphate at the P level is the Olsen P test. Now there's various P tests or phosphate tests a lab could use, and in fact most of the world does actually use the Olsen P test, but some countries do have a favor other tests. And what's really good in New Zealand is we've been using that test ever since like post-war period. So there's literally thousands upon thousands of tests that have done on various soil types over the decades. So there's a very good understanding of how plants respond to a certain level that's given in the Olsen P test. And what we see in latter years is tend to be smaller companies trying to make a point of difference. So they'll say, no, we need a test from the States, whatever test. And I'm always a wee bit critical of that, because we have such a strong body of evidence for what we're doing under conventional management as it is, and really good statistics, and really good all the research and field trials have all been based around this type of testing. Also, there you see the term anion storage capacity, and that's the capacity of different soils to hold on to phosphate, if you like, and retain it. For example, a ash soil that you tend to get up in the North Island, middle of the North Island, they have what we call a much higher anion storage capacity. And that is, you have to apply a lot more phosphate to that soil before you actually get release of phosphate back into the soil solution. So unlike our sedimentary soils down here in the South Island, which is quite low levels of phosphate, as defined by the Olsen P test, to get the same effect. Has anyone heard about what's called high retention soils or anion storage capacity soils? Has anyone got an experience of that?
Heard of it, but don't really have experience.
Yeah. So I'll probably leave it there on that one. It's just that although up in these high retention soils, these soils, well, they're actually called allophanic soils, these volcanic soils, although it takes a lot of phosphate to get them up to a sort of fertile level, if you like, it's like a lot of money in the bank. It also, they perform without adding more phosphate over a longer time. All right, now let's move on to nitrogen. So like we've talked about in session 1, it's a very changeable, dynamic, mobile nutrient. It changes very quickly. It can, for example, after those rains we just had down here, there would virtually be no nitrogen left, or available nitrogen left in the topsoil at all after all that leaching that would have got on. So it's constantly also being released from organic matter in the soil, and also plant material, roots, foliage, whatever that is breaking down, trash, all the trash that's breaking down, and the nitrogen's being mineralized over time as well, within a season. Now, the two main types of nitrogen I want to talk about today, and the tests we do for them, is the available nitrogen, which is the mineral N test, or also called the deep N test, and that is the available nitrogen, both the nitrate and the ammonia form. And in the class we talked about the strip test that we can do with a soil sample. This is testing for nitrates, which is mostly what we find in a soil. Nitrogen converts from ammonia to nitrate quite quickly, particularly when it's warm and moist. So most of the N in the soil is actually nitrate. And this is a rough and ready and very cheap test that gives us a really good at any point in time, what's the level of nitrates in the soil. So the other one that is becoming more and more in the spotlight is PMN test, which is a potentially mineralizable nitrogen. So this is really determining the background level of organic matter in a soil. And then the software we talked about, using what's called the Sustainable Vegetable Systems model, nitrogen modeling system, using the weather, the average weather for that location, for that soil type, for that amount of organic matter that is determined in the soil test, can give us extrapolating out through the season what will be the available nitrogen that's released from the organic matter. And so that SVS system is at the moment is set up particularly for vegetable growers. It's not for permanent crops, but for annual vegetable crops. So all the other testing, soil test results of the other than phosphate is potassium, magnesium, calcium, sulfur. Those are the macronutrients we test for. In some cases, people will test for micronutrients in the soil. Now, generally, it's considered not to be too reliable to test for micronutrients, just because they're micronutrients, and it doesn't take much contamination to give you a false positive. So generally in horticulture, we don't usefully test for micronutrients other than maybe boron, which is used to test for boron levels, and that's particularly important for things like cauliflower and brassicas. And what we tend to rely on more is tissue tests that are done in the growing season, and that gives us a better idea generally if we've got any problems with micronutrients. And here's an example of, if anyone wants to know more about the nitrogen tests, it can be very confusing just how many different nitrogen tests there are, but this is a page from Hill's Laboratory with some of their testing. Or sorry, lab tests. So this is an example of tracking soil test results over time, the trends over time. And if we look at this case of pH, here's the results of pH over 4 years, and we can see the graph down here. So someone probably applied some lime in 2017 when really they're at the top of the optimum. They actually drove the pH a wee bit too high. And in this case, you can actually have some problems of getting into deficiencies, particularly manganese deficiency, because we're out of the optimum pH range. But this is the classical change in pH over time. This is exactly as we would expect. It's changed from 6.8 to 7.1 down to 6.8, and that's a drop of 0.3 in 1 year, which is exactly the sort of drop we expect. So yeah, I quite like the results we're seeing here in the testing. But over here in the phosphate, we see it's gone from 25, 34. Now, down here, we can see in the graph, our optimum is between 30 and 60. So someone's applied some phosphate in here, but then it's jumped up to 43. And then the next year, it's dropped down to 36. Now, I look at this and can see that there's a problem with the results because that just does not make sense. So to put it in perspective, to change the Olsen P test here by 1 unit, say to go from 34 to 35, it takes about 10 kilos of phosphate. Now, 10 kilos of phosphate is about just over 100 kilos of superphosphate. So for this to jump from 34 to 43, it's like someone had put on a ton of superphosphate. which in a horticultural, I can't remember where this test came from, but let's assume it's apples, no one would have done that. So that's a signal. And then the next year it drops back down to 36 again, which is somewhere near that 34. This doesn't make sense to me, so it would indicate it's a problem with the sampling. So you can see the importance of monitoring trends over time. If I'd seen this value in 2019, I would have discounted the 43 and thought, no, I don't believe this result. And this is the danger if you're only responding to soil tests from just 1 year in permanent cropping. It can completely give you the wrong assumption. And here's an example of, I was just working on this yesterday, so I thought to include this. So this is some work for Konu, where Norman and Marie work. And there's something like 35 odd blocks here that we're working with. Huge amount of information. So I've, in each one of these blocks, added the latest soil test results that they've just got back in. So I've looked at the trends over time and made a decision on each block. And if you can, I know it's hard to see and you won't be able to read the detail, but the bottom of each graph, there's my decision making there, some comments about the different nutrients. And then in the spreadsheet, that flows through to another tab, which is this one. And each one of those comments are out to the right here, and one line across here is one block. So that's Pamariki, sub-block north, and each one of these columns is a different fertilizer option for me to choose from, if you like. And I'm just putting here as giving this example that, like I said before, historically people would have applied a maintenance fertilizer every year to apples, and it used to be called in this area, Ravensdown Orchard Mix. And people would apply a couple of 100 kilos, come what may. They might even have got some soil testing done, but probably didn't make a judgment based on that soil test. So each one of these lines relates to one of those graphs and my comments here. And I've started going through it yesterday. And you can see how few fertilizer mixes are going on these various blocks. These results here at the moment, these values are from the previous season, from last season. And I would anticipate, just quickly looking at the results so far, that there'll even be a reduction this year. There might only be 3 or 4 blocks that get any superphosphate or potassium this season. So it all comes back from monitoring those trends over time. Let's look at this one that says 400 kilos of potash super. So this is a mixture of potash, potassium, and phosphate. And the results this year, if I look at it, pH is optimum, P is low, K is low, calcium is okay, magnesium is within optimum. So this looks to me like we gave it 400 kilos last year. It's still low P and low K. So it will get this again this year, along with just some pot sulfate in November. But going through some of these others, this one here, which was getting 250 kilos a hectare of superphosphate. Once again, P is just below optimum, K is optimum. So that actually might get some more. It looks like it's brought it, that application last year brought it up somewhat, but it's still just slightly below optimum, so it might get more. Any questions on that? Okay, this is an example from kiwi fruit from up north, from Sandy's presentation. And if we just look at phosphate here, once again, this is the most recent one, 2024, 54, Olsen P of 54, previous year Olsen P of 72. Once again, that is a huge change. I should add for apples, a 70, if we were looking at, say this year, an Olsen P of 36, if we were looking to how much phosphate does a 70-ton crop of apples remove per hectare, it would be 7 kilos, which is less than 1 unit. If we didn't apply any fertilizer here, and the field sampling and the lab was super accurate, this would only get reduced by 1 unit. It would go from 36 to 35. That's how little phosphate we're actually removing from a high-yielding crop. So kiwi fruit, I can't remember off the top of my head what a good yield removes, but it's lucky if it would go down 2 units. So it couldn't possibly go down from 72 to 54. And for me, this really highlights that our biggest source of error is from the field, is the soil sampling that we do in the field. So if we go back to Ponu again, so what they've done this year is the person that does their soil sampling for them, they've given instructions for each block to record which rows they go down. So for example, this is block 1, Pamarika North. They've gone down row 20, taken over the whole block, they want 15 or 20 samples, individual samples. So they've walked down row 20, back up row 46, down row 68 and 90. And what they'll start, instead of randomly taking the sample across the block that they've done historically, going forward now, every year, they will go down these same rows to try and get consistency. And that's what I've just described is when we went through the process in the Waimeas of doing the NZ-GAP environmental module, which is like the equivalent of what we think is a freshwater plan is going to look like. That is one of the biggest things we found when we were doing these freshwater farm plans for permanent crop growers, was consistently sampling from the same rows. They randomly take it from wherever down that row, but they're still going each year going back to the same rows. So, Joss, what do you guys do?
In general, we will go back to the same rows in the same blocks. What we tend to do, going back to that annual versus a little bit longer time frame, is we'll usually alternate from year to year.
Yep.
So this year we'll have plan A, we'll call it. Next year we'll go plan B, and then the following year back to plan A. So over 2 years we're covering, I think we take something like 12 to 15 samples across the orchard, and we're covering quite a broad selection of the soil that we're dealing with, sort of 2 year on 2 year.
And I really like that you'll have very good records of that too, won't you?
Yeah. So we've got records of exactly that same soil going back more than 10 years in most cases, sometimes 20 odd.
Oh, sorry. What I meant was you've got very good records. What's plan B? What's plan B, plan A?
Yeah.
Where historically the people have just gone out and just taken a random sample from whatever and not really even starting with a plan.
Yeah, no, everything we've done, like I say, for quite some time now has been pretty regimented, and it does
documented.
Documented and regimented, and it results in something we can, spot trends and things across time.
Yeah, excellent. Have you got anything to add, Norman?
No, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see, because I mean, we've obviously changed some of our tests this year as well, based on some observations around soil types, because we do have some blocks with different soil types that in the past might have sort of all been meshed together in one test. So we've tried to separate a few of those. It's probably early days to sort of see some of those trends. Be interesting to see if they sort of match some previous years where we had those sort of combined blocks as well.
Mm.
and if there's any sort of anything that stands out. But yeah, I'm sure we'll catch up on that one.
And I think what's happening now is we're seeing increased professionalism, which is my big thing. Is we have to understand systems, whether that be what we're talking about now, or a life cycle of an insect, or a life cycle of a disease. And we're seeing much more professionalism nowadays with people understanding systems, compared to what we used to do, which was family run businesses, which were, very small, lack of skilled staff. Now we're seeing a lot of more professionalism coming into horticulture, which is great.
Yeah, and I think for those, like you said, those nutrient management plans, I mean, those sorts of things you have to stump up with for Global Gap and LEAF as well. So yeah, you've got to make sure that you're only applying what you need when you need it.
Yep. Okay, so can you people tell me what the 4 R's of nutrient management, 4 R's of nutrient management is? How's your memory?
Right place, right amount, right time, and something else.
Right
One more to go. That's very good.
Right product.
Oh, very good.
There we go.
Right rate, right plot, right source, right placement, and right timing. So yeah, it all comes down to these 4 R's. So we'll talk a wee bit more about that. First of all, nutrient budgets. So yeah, this is an example of Overseer, and it's based, as you say, Norman, on what the plant needs. It's all about trying to. There's no point. A lot of people think plants get their energy from fertilizers. They do not. A plant gets its energy from photosynthesis from the sun. So nutrients are only there in optimum amounts to allow the plant to carry out all its biological functions, from photosynthesis to reproduction to pollen production, or creating all the different tissues required in the plant. Nutrients are only required to facilitate those biological functions. Nutrients do not cause plants to grow. The energy comes from the sun, except for maybe nitrogen, which is a growth promoter. That's the only one that's, but still the core energy comes from the sun. So here we have an example of a nutrient budget. And if we just take nitrogen, for example, this area of the table here is all about the nutrients added, whether they be from fertilizer, rain, irrigation, or foliar spray. And the value is amount of N per hectare. So nearly 40 kilos is coming in from fertilizer, 10 kilos comes from the rain, and 17 from the irrigation water. Then the budget looks at how much is removed in product. 28 kilos per hectare is removed in this case, I'm pretty sure it's apples. Actually, no, probably kiwi fruit because it's too much for apples. No, sorry, correct me. I'm wrong. It is apples because it's 7 kilos per hectare removed in P. So 28 kilos comes out in nitrogen. To the atmosphere is 3 kilos, and to water is 9 kilos. So that's what's the calculation for leaching. Now we're seeing more and more of these used by councils for resource consents, particularly in Canterbury. Originally, Overseer, this nutrient budget was created to look at modelling different scenarios to improve environmental outcomes without getting too caught up in the number. It was really about looking at what scenario was high leaching, medium leaching, or low leaching. But more and more over time, it's been used. The output of leaching, this number, to water 9, more and more it's been used as a compliance number, which is not how it was originally intended.
Those numbers, Mike, from testing, or are some of those like generic values? So if we've got like rain and clover and irrigation and foliar sprays for nitrogen, is that
Yeah.
measured?
Well, what the model uses is that your soil type, your weather. It makes assumptions, things like irrigation, to best practice. For instance, you might be on a property that is over irrigating, and you could be leaching more than this. But the assumption from the model, from memory, there is a question there that says, are you using soil moisture monitoring? And if you are, it's best practice. It assumes you're doing best practice. So there's still a lot happening here, which is open for interpretation, I suppose. We tend to not use this in horticulture. I know of no enterprise that is using this in horticulture. We used to use it, or I used to use it certainly in horticulture when it was free, but it now costs, I think it's $600 per entity or per block to use this software. So I've yet to find a horticultural enterprise that is using it. But it's very common. Every dairy farm is doing this annually. If we look at the vegetable industry, they've created some very simple nutrient budgets that can be used with the nutrient management manual for vegetable industry, where you can calculate your intended fertilizer program, work out for each application how much nitrogen is going on per hectare, look at the book for what type of crop you've got, what sort of yield you expect. It'll tell you, give you advice on what's the total, for example, N that is required to produce that crop on that soil type in that season. And you can compare what your intention is with advice from the manual, and you could work through the flow chart and pop out whether you're applying too much or not applying enough. So this is a basic nutrient budget for nitrogen, which is much less complicated than working through an Overseer model, a computer model like Overseer. They've also got one for phosphorus as well for vegetable production. And there's also a basic one for kiwi fruit that the kiwi fruit industry has developed over the last couple of years. And the interesting thing about this is it's really made people can look at their own situation and question, do we really need as much nitrogen per hectare, applied per hectare as we think we do? And there's been, I know up north in the North Island, there's been a steady decrease in the amount of nitrogen per hectare applied, with people just becoming more aware of these issues and going through this process. So historically, people, fertilizer is just another job in your season, and you would apply, it's just evolved over time, you would apply X amount for the season to make sure that you've got enough. It's without a lot of consideration, do you really need that much? No, it's just another activity. It costs X amount of dollars. Do I really care if I spend another $100 or $200 a hectare applying a wee bit more than I need? Wasn't really it's not really something we considered. We just did it. But nowadays there's a real movement to justify any nutrient we apply to the land for obvious reasons. Right, timing. The obvious ones, we wouldn't go out in strong windy conditions because the fertilizer we're applying wasn't going to meet the target. Soil moisture, historically people like to apply when some moderate rain is coming. If we apply in excessive soil moisture levels and then get more rain, that's when we can get serious runoff issues and leaching. We don't necessarily have to apply all different types of fertilizers when we know there's a bit of rain coming to wash it in. That's historically the sort of management practice we've had, but it's really only important for materials like urea, which has to go through 3 or 4 different stages to become plant available. And it's in those early stages if it's dry and then we get just a bit of moisture, but not enough moisture to wash the urea in, we can get volatilization. That's gassing off of some of the nitrogen into the atmosphere. We can lose up to 20-25% of the nitrogen through volatilization. But mostly the other nitrogen fertilizers we use have already gone through those, are already at a later stage of availability, if you like, and there's a lot less chance of volatilization. So yeah, some people still focus on, I've got to apply my fertilizer when a wee bit of rain's coming, 10 or 20 mils are coming, but it's not really that important as we think. Any questions around that?
Would that still be a good practice to do? I mean, assuming the soil moisture is not at that saturation point, does a little bit of rain help it wash in? Because I mean, I hear that here actually all the time when it's fertilizer application time.
What's really interesting, if you were to look, we go back to Overseer, and I've done this with modeling on grapes. Our example we have at work on grapes on a hillside. And when I put that through Overseer, it says I could reduce the loss of phosphate to the environment. And you know, our place at work, there's a little stream at the bottom of the grapes, Norman. I can't remember the numbers now, but it reduced the loss to the environment of phosphate from about 30-40%. If we delayed from spring application and delayed it into November. So what it's saying is the average rainfall is reduced in November, and it's less likely to be a loss down the hillside if we apply it later rather than in the spring, which we get higher rainfall. But then, of course, your question would be, is there enough water around then, rain or whatever, to wash it in? And for something like phosphate, I'd say yes, it is, because phosphate's not something that we need straight away. It's quite a passive nutrient. We just need enough in the background, and we don't need a big burst for permanent crops. We don't need a big burst of phosphate in the spring. It's like it doesn't sort of matter when it gets in there, as long as it gets in there over the season. As long as if we do need it, as long as we're replacing it at some stage over the season, it generally is sufficient. Potassium does need washing in, but it doesn't take much to get it in. So, you know, those late spring, early summer rains, it would be less important. I suppose the short answer is no. It's probably going to get enough at some stage, Norman. What would be important is your nitrogen application apples post-harvest. If we go back to your plan here, we've said we want CAN, calcium ammonium nitrate, applied 100 kilos per hectare post-harvest at the end of the season. So that's the important one to get. Because while there's still a transpiration stream, there's water still moving up through the plant. Just post-harvest, we want to get that nitrogen on as soon as possible, and hopefully there's enough rainfall to get it in the ground and into the soil solution as well. So that one to me is important, to get it with a wee bit of rainfall to get it in. But your standard phosphate and potassium, I wouldn't be too concerned about.
Okay.
Split applications, important, and the rates over a season to meet plant utilization. And this is particularly important for vegetable production. I think I've told you an example here. What we saw in some growers when we looked at it in Nelson was they were putting the right amount of nitrogen on to meet the plant needs over the growing season, say a crop of broccoli, but it was about the timing. Often we're putting too much on in the early part of the season where the plant doesn't need much nitrogen, hardly any, and then not enough to finish the crop. So basically just moving the nitrogen forward towards harvest a bit. I mean, if they haven't got enough to finish a crop and it doesn't meet spec, say the head of the broccoli or cauliflower doesn't meet the spec, I mean, that's out of spec, and that's either non-marketable or marketable at a lower price, tag 2. So yeah, really timing, it's not just the amount, rate and time, it's the timing. The correct rate at the correct time for the plant to be able to utilize it. If we're applying too much early on, there's only one, if it's nitrogen, there's only one place it's going, and that's downward. Now, in the case of phosphate, we might, on vegetables, we might not apply, if it's got high residual levels of phosphate, we might not apply any phosphate in the growing season because it's got enough. But we would tend to put a certain amount of phosphate at sowing time or transplanting time, because soluble phosphate helps plants, and virtually any type of plant that's newly planted and newly sown, it will help them establish, even though it's got a high background phosphate level. So yeah, even though, once again, it's understanding systems and understanding the plant that we're dealing with for best decision making. There's more compost and mulches being used nowadays and cover crops. But so yeah, if we're applying compost, particularly for organic growing, we need to know the nutrient levels. A lot of people think throwing a lot of organic matter around is really great, and it is. It's great for soil structure, wonderful for biological activity and soil structure. But we've got to be careful that what impact is having that on nitrogen levels. If we have a warm, moist conditions, we have accelerated mineralization of the organic matter and nitrogen release. Is that nitrogen release happening at a time we wanted it to happen? Some work done by Plant and Food Research over the last couple of years, a block where we're looking at rotations over time, over a 4-year period. Interesting results there, and this is, a lot of this is new stuff that we haven't seen before. A block of broccoli hoed in the winter. It wasn't till the following September that suddenly you got a massive burst of nitrogen. Now you would have assumed that as we got into the spring, we'd see mineralization of that organic matter from the previous broccoli trash, all the stems and stalks going back in the ground. You'd think that would be mineralized and released as a slow release over time, but no, it didn't happen that way. It was a massive release, sort of mid-September from memory, just a big burst. And once again, understanding systems, understanding effects, and monitoring levels. Phosphorus application. Historically, most phosphate has been applied as superphosphate, which is highly available, highly soluble, highly available, and then over 30 to 50, 60 days, what isn't being utilized is a lot of it is being absorbed onto soil particles and held very, very strongly. But there's another product that the organic people use, and they'll use it in hill country and pasture, called RPR, reactive phosphate rock. So it hasn't been through the factory and been processed. It's still in its original form, if you like, which is a soft phosphate rock. And that's very dependent on soil pH and time to break down and become available. And it really needs a pH, a lower pH to break down, around 5.8. And they don't really like to apply it in situations above a pH of 6. But in horticulture, most of our optimum is between sort of 5.86 to 6.8. And most of our blocks would be in that mid-range of about 6.5, which would be too high to actually get the breakdown from the phosphate RPR, reactive phosphate rock. So once again, it's understanding the beast that you're dealing with and understanding the environment and the implications. The other thing with phosphate is all phosphate generally will have some form of cadmium contamination, if you like. So cadmium is a heavy metal, and however, the big companies, Ravensdown, Balance, they spend a lot of effort to source material and mix it to keep the cadmium's level down below an acceptable level, which is quite low. Compost should be, as we mentioned before, tested for their nutrient levels. And when applying, really important not to overshoot the margins of your target. Next to a lot of blocks are waterways or drains or channels, and we don't want to be putting any of these nutrients into this areas that have got no crop in them. And certainly what we're seeing more and more is increased targeted application systems. You'll find on the in vegetable blocks, they'll try and not spread any granules into the wheel rut part of the row. They'll actually, a lot of systems now will actually dribble the fertilizer post planting or post sowing or transplanting. They'll dribble the fertilizer down a tube right next to the plant or the row between plants as you go down the row. Being quite careful to target it where the plant is. So really important that we don't make sure that any fertilizer application doesn't go out further than the target row. So, winter nutrients. What are some of the considerations about using nutrients in the winter?
I guess the amount of rainfall and your soil moisture.
Yeah, rainfall, soil moisture. Yep.
Is it too cold? Is there limitation to what the plant can take up?
Absolutely. Yeah, spot on. Yep. So the plant's metabolic rate or transpiration stream, it really slows down in winter months. My example, I was thinking about this today. I've got a little greenhouse at home. So I've got pepper plants, a few pepper plants, and they're grown in big bins. And this year I've just left them in there. Instead of roguing them out when they've finished, I've just left them in there. And they shouldn't get frosted. And come spring, I'll just lop them off at the bottom and let them sprout away again, just see what happens. So I was saying today, I literally don't even check them anymore. I've only watered them once or twice since winter. They're going through so little water. Now, they were being irrigated twice a day. And now it's lucky if it's every 6 weeks. They're perfectly green, full leaf area, but they're absolutely going through no water at all. So the metabolic rate, the transpiration stream has just absolutely plummeted. And it's amazing. So yeah, saturated soils at the bottom here, greater risk of leaching and runoff. As soils become saturated, if there's any sort of slope, the phosphate can travel overland, call it overland flow. So we also look at any fallow blocks. Fallow block is where it's been cultivated or a herbicide has been put over and it's just fallow. There's no plant material in it. Those are at extreme risk of leaching and nutrient loss there's no plants there to mop up the nitrogen or any other nutrients. And also we're getting the effects of impact of rain on the soil, destroying soil structure. All right, how many people have we got, Nadine? Have we got enough to split into 2 groups?
Mike, can I just ask you a question if that's okay?
Sorry, what's that?
Can I just ask you a question if that's okay?
Oh, yeah, go for it. Yep.
Yeah, no, just looking through that winter, the winter conversation about plants, I suppose, not utilising stuff. We're seeing significant changes in in winter. I think in winter temperatures and bits and pieces. Do you think that's having an impact on nutrient use? Like, are you noticing in that hort sector any sort of early or continued growth over the winter? Over.
Yeah, it's anecdotal at this stage, I think, Simon. But yeah, I've certainly been shocked at times. But we say that quite often every year. Say, look at these buds coming out on blah blah. You know, tend to say it's hard to quantify.
We always have a false spring in Canterbury, but I drove past a guy the other day mowing his lawns, and I'm going, you know, July's not a month to mow your lawns, not in Canterbury. But he was getting quite a bit off them.
I think, I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, we've got to listen to the climate scientists and you know, the data that's coming down through there. You know, the anecdote I've really noticed this year, I keep on saying our property, our house is green. That's everywhere I look, on the driveway, on the deck, everything's so green this year. It's from slimy algae and mold and stuff that I've never seen before, and just shows how wet it's been. But I haven't looked at the stats for how a winter chill. That's one we always look at. What's the winter chilling looks like? And the reality is, over the years, it changes a lot. You know, it's hard to, in the timelines that we experience, it's hard to put. I think it's dangerous for us to put a number on it. We've really got to listen to the climate scientists who do the research over a long period of time. That would be.
Yeah. Oh, no, thanks for that. No.
I don't know. Has anyone else got any other comments? All right.
We got 6 people, so split them into 2. How long do you want them?
Well, I'm just thinking maybe we haven't got enough for that. Maybe we just do it in one big group.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would only be 3 in each.
Yeah.
And it is 4 o'clock, so just, you know, it depends how much time we need to finish. So what I want us to discuss now, and I want to stay out of this, I want someone else to be the facilitator. That was the idea of splitting into groups. Thinking about the field trip site or the case study, what are some things growers could do to mitigate, manage the risks to fresh water from their nutrient management? Now, I suppose from the field trip, we didn't really spend too much time on nutrient management with Karen, did we?
A little bit. I think she. I got a little bit of feedback from her, and I guess looking at the soil maps, there's for the most part it's quite stony, but there's small areas of glade that I've seen in there as well. But I think she was saying she manages things basically block by block, soil type by soil type, and irrigation and nutrient management. She just does a little bit often. And I guess she does regular testing, like that quick end test as well, so make sure there's no leaching going on. But I think that's the way she's managing what is, you know, potentially very high risk leaching blocks, is to just do a little bit regularly, which I think you mentioned earlier on, Mike, as well. And she's also come to the decision, I think, with some of those really stony blocks that actually it's just not suitable for crops, so they put a grass cover there permanently. So that will also help with any runoff potentially, depending where it is. But those are the sorts of things that I picked up from that field trip.
Anyone else?
No, I probably just support Norman's comments, really. I mean, obviously they'd had that ephemeral stream that they'd planted out in permanent pasture to help mitigate the impacts there, and they were looking to maybe put that into a permanent planting of other than pasture.
That's right.
So there's a bit of that.
So what are the challenges and the risks of the vegetable property compared to the permanent crop type property enterprise that, so far most of what I've talked about has been permanent crops.
It's cultivation, isn't it? I mean, it's that continual turning of the soils or replace, and so leaving it exposed. Yeah, I think that's probably what I took out of it. I mean, I just started doing a bit of work on assignment 3, and I'm thinking that visit was pretty quick, and I did take a few notes, but sort of having to delve in quite deep there into the imaginary passage of my brain quite deeply to get something that's gonna fit there. So that's maybe something, Mike, and I don't know whether it's appropriate, but maybe a little bit of an overview of the management style that they do there could be quite useful for all of us completing that thing. I'm not asking for a document that says what they do, but the things that they consider, or I think that could be kind of useful, because I just sort of trying to get my head around assignment 3, which is just those 2 grids is all we have to submit. Yeah.
So I
yes.
Yeah.
I've just been brought in as the hired gun on this. I didn't set up the course, so it's new to me as well. I can't remember.
I didn't set it up either, but I did create the Moodle, so I know. Yeah, it is just those 2 templates for that one.
Okay. Has anyone else had a look at assignment 3? Have they got any questions or thoughts around what might be required?
Yeah, I've had a go at the field trip one. I've still got a few tweaks to make, but
well, here I am. Hammer me with the questions. I do know that property quite well. Okay, so if we could just contrast that from Norman's easy nutrient management situation, there's multiple crops per year. Where do you soil test? When you go and soil test a block, half of it could have been in lettuces getting X, the other half could have been in broccoli getting something else. They try and have these separate blocks, but it's such a dynamic, changeable environment it's just totally out of control compared to a permanent crop scenario, where it's much easier to get consistent results over time. So it's a real challenge. In your permanent crop, you don't have to really check for nitrogen use weekly like they are, and some crops are doing it weekly or bi-weekly. You can do it through tissue testing in November, which is generally when we find out if there's any problems with nitrogen in a permanent crop. But a vegetable crop's quite different. But then they're putting on, for example, for your apples, most of those blocks were putting on, 26 kilos a hectare of nitrogen. On the vegetable side, they might be putting 140, 160 kilos of nitrogen in one rotation, and they might be doing 2.5 rotations per year. So there's a huge difference in management. So they historically would just, up until 2 or 3 years ago, put on significant amounts of an NPK type of fertilizer, whether they needed the P or the K or not. So now they've shifted to just putting some P on at transplant or sowing time with some nitrogen, K if they need it from soil testing, and then side dressings for the rest of the season would be straight nitrogen, no NPK. Quite often, a lot of vegetable enterprises were putting on the NPK, which would be Mila Complex or the old Nitrofosca Blue. Sometimes they'd put a dose on, 2 or 3 weeks before harvest, and the phosphate wouldn't even be usable in that. It wouldn't even get the soil solution and be used in that time, or very little of it. So that's some of the management changes we've had. Once it's, what have we talked about today? And in this situation, the right rate, the right time, and the right product.
Do they do a lot of observations in terms of the vegetable crops, in terms of deficiencies? Are they more reliant on that?
They will, and they'll take some tissue tests and send them away, but it's more of a learning and exercise. Invariably, with an annual crop, by the time you learn you've got a problem, it's too late. Unlike and historically they're not necessarily doing tissue testing just to see if they're okay. They tend to do it when they've got a problem. Unlike you, a permanent crop, where you tend to do a certain amount of tissue testing in November to see, are you on track? But you're monoculture. Once again, you only have to think about it that one time of the year, where they might have 40 different blocks at different growth stages, thinking, it's just a relentless it's just a relentless task what they're doing compared to what you do in a permanent crop.
Yeah, I think one of the other strategies you mentioned as well, which maybe they weren't doing before, was just to have particular rows that the tractor drives down, whether it's fertilizing or whatever it's doing, rather than so there's only sort of one set of tracks maybe down. Was it 12 rows or something like that from memory?
Yeah, and I think it's also the same size as their irrigator as well. I think the irrigator does 12 on each side.
Right.
Yeah. So sorry?
Didn't you say something about crop rotation as well?
Yes, we'll come to that further on. Yeah, and it's interesting. What's the main reason for crop rotation?
Different plants would use different.
Manage risk.
Sorry, say it again.
Manage risk.
Yeah, what risk? That's right. What is the main risk?
Market risk. Market risk.
No, I'm talking about rotation of different crops within a block.
Disease.
Disease.
Yep, disease. So that's what I put in this presentation today, at all the bullet points of, the advantages environmentally for rotation, but it's not the main reason why growers rotate. It's actually disease. And historically, it was the only measure. Over time, over the decades, we've tended to be chemical driven, and now more and more it's coming back through traditional rotational practices to make sure we don't get a prevalence of disease. These guys in Nelson, though, there's a strong. We've got a lot of clubroot and brassicas, because the reality is that brassicas have obviously returned good money, and they're just overused brassicas in a lot of these blocks, unfortunately. So they've built up clubroot inoculum, which is a fungus. Right, more questions about the field trip? What other areas around nutrient management? What other questions were there?
I think there was a bit risk factors. Obviously, there was a drain that ran through the property on an ephemeral stream, so that was obviously there.
Yeah,
a couple of photos of that, but and I think the soil types, I agree with what Norman sort of said. You could say it's all one soil type. When you actually dig in a bit deeper, there is some pockets that are a bit different, which have have an issue on the nutrient side of things. The climate. Well, we could talk about the risk of significant rainfall in July on leaching.
Yep,
that's just happened.
Did you remember that it's about 45% stone? So that's only basically half the volume of soil for exploitation. Yeah, and that's the reason why it's such poor low water holding capacity, and potentially high risk of leaching.
45% stone.
Yeah, up to. It varies. If you pulled, you pulled the SMAP descriptor on that soil, didn't you? Did you remember the range? Was it like 30 to 45%?
Yeah, I think I did. I did. Well, I did pull it, and I've got them tucked away somewhere in a secret location, which probably I couldn't find at the drop of a hat. But
it's also quite undulated.
Sorry,
when you
Marie?
when you actually drive along, like it looks flat to begin with, but it's actually quite undulated, only slightly, but it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's where you get these historical channels. If you didn't have a stock bank, that's where the traditional channels would have worked through the property, and quite a lot of the year there would have been water running through parts of that.
Yeah.
Actually, I think she mentioned that they also had some. Was there a little bit of runoff from the neighbour as well? They were trying to manage.
That's pretty much a spring that comes from the under the road from the neighbouring property. Yep. And we can't stop, a natural waterway like that.
Yep.
So we'll talk about it more in a minute, but the goal is to slow it down and to drop the sediment out in your property, retain the sediment in your property.
Yeah, I guess from the sort of catchment perspective too, I guess it's a two-way thing. I guess you've got the stock banks there now, but if that goes, the flooding could be the other way in terms of flooding out from the river onto those properties, as opposed to nutrients flowing, from the surrounding farms into the river as well. So yeah, so couple
just
of
looking
things
at
to
those
consider
maps. Sorry, Norman. Just looking at those maps, Mike. I did find them. Yeah, you're right. 35%. Yeah, maybe even higher in places. That's on the alluvial, the floodplain one. The terrace one, the alternative soil type's quite a bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Hastings soil.
Yeah, I physically, not that property, but adjoining property, I took I took 20 litres of soil, and I actually screened it out in a 5mm screen, and I got 45% stone. And there was still chips just under 5mm left it's higher than that, really. Yeah. All right, shall we box on? Any more questions around the vegetable unit? How are you getting on, Charlotte, with the assignment? All done and dusted?
Oh yes. No, I've been away and sick, unfortunately, but just been looking at it now, and I did try and do as much as I could in the field. I think it might be some of it might be a little bit blurred from the rain, but I will think I'm okay based on that discussion. Maybe with the sorry, a bit of a stupid question probably, but the online case study template. So it's the two matrices that we have to fill in. There's the field trip, which is a question 1. Question 2 is the online case study template. What case study do we use? I've probably missed something critical there, but so it's like a repeat of the field trip matrix, but it says online case study. I'm just not sure whether we choose one or if we've been allocated one. I did miss the online session we had a couple of weeks ago, so it's probably talked about then. So
Nadine, can you answer that? Sorry, Nadine, can you answer that one?
Yeah, I'm just quickly going through the Moodle myself to find it. Here it is. It's in the course resources. There's a case study in there. So and an orchard map for assessment. So I'm wondering if those are what you're looking for. I didn't write these, unfortunately, but I did upload them. So I was trying to, for the life of me, find it. I'll copy the link in here. This might be what you're looking for.
Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
That makes sense. Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks very much. So is that one of the Waikato?
Simon.
Yeah, we did talk about that in that last session. We talked about the tables in that case study that weren't correct.
That's right.
I see nothing's happened.
That's right.
Yes, and I remember taking Sandy in there. Although she's been very, very busy, so yeah, unfortunately she's not fixed that yet. I don't have a horticultural background to help on that one. Just tech, sorry.
Okay, I'll just note it anyway. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't
I
really been back to it since then, but
yeah, I just think you probably just use common sense, and I'm sure Sandy will see common sense when she marks them. All right, shall we box on? Erosion-prone areas. So yeah, we need to improve drainage in prone areas, and it's an interesting one. So you improve drainage. This is always an interesting one for me, because you look for a free draining soil with a free draining soil to grow vegetables on, but a free draining soil is probably the worst for leaching. The more free draining it is, the more at risk you are for N loss through leaching. But you still need to have good drainage. So yeah, plants and trees improve drainage. We've got any plant will improve the soil structure as roots grow down through a soil. Those roots are constantly dying or smaller roots are constantly dying and being replaced. So providing percolation channels through a soil, improving drainage. Just the process of growing plants in a soil through all the biological processes and respiration that's going on in the roots. And we have release of exudates and whatnot from the plant roots. It all helps in soil structure and soil biology. So yeah, plants are good. And for erosion prone areas, we need cover crops, we need grass, we need vegetation. One of the things we do see with erosion prone areas is when we get pieces scarfing or road earthworks on a hill, and as soon as we do a cut into it, and when we've got trees around, then we get the rainfall that we've just had here in Nelson, and then wonder why all the trees fall over. As soon as we disturb that environment and start making cuts into it, like we see in this image here, we're very prone to erosion, particularly with wind and high wind after rain. Sediment traps, even temporary ones at high-risk areas. We can see an example here of the common sediment traps that are used. We see this a lot nowadays when they're doing roadworks around new roadways, etc., to contain the sediment within the site. When we get very saturated soils, we can easily get compaction, and which then leads to more problems with water buildup on compacted soils, and it gets worse and worse. We certainly have issues around high flow, high energy parts of a river. In certain parts of the river where we get increased flow, increased energy, we have erosion of banks, and then that sediment, of course, is carried on in the water down through the waterway. So ephemeral waterways or intermittent waterways, and the good example would be get rid of that, is what we saw at Appleby Fresh with Karen, where we see this intermittent water pathway with water in it, whereas commonly in the season we don't see any water. So there's ephemeral intermittent waterways. When you part of the process, we're getting maps generated for our freshwater plans that we're developing here in the Waimeas. One of the plans would give one of the databases overlay would give us a blue line through properties where these ephemeral intermittent waterways were. And it was quite interesting. It was the wider the blue line, the bigger the potential flow. And it was quite accurate. And like you said earlier, Marie, those it was quite undulating, the block at Appleby Fresh. And yeah, in the middle of those channels or pathways on the mapping, you get a blue line, and it would show exactly where they were, which was quite useful, quite interesting. So once we establish where they are, we can improve them, and if required, if it needs to be an open drain to improve drainage, that's one thing. But in the case of this pathway, waterway that Karen was showing us, the intention is to build up the sides with permanent plantings, native plantings. And the idea is to, as long as it isn't becoming a flood risk, to slow that waterway down so all the sediment is retained within the property. So if we were to if that flow had no impediments and it was a high flow, that sediment can be forced out into the main waterway, into the Waimeas, and potentially that sediment can go downstream. And this is what we're trying to avoid. And certainly what they've done there is reduce cultivation anywhere near that pathway. Prior to Karen being there, this was all open soil. So doing what they've done, just planting grass initially, would have had a huge effect in reducing the amount of sediment moving down that pathway. Just slowing the energy down. As you slow the energy down of the river, the smaller particles drop out. Open drains and pathways that build up sediment over time, when eventually they'll need clearing out of that sediment. And the point here is that it should be spread evenly over nearby land. Why do we want to spread it evenly? Why don't we just put it in a heap somewhere? Any idea?
I guess you'd have a similar issue again if you just got a large pile of it and you get another heavy rain event. It's probably just going to wash away. Yeah, that wouldn't be sensible. But the main reason is actually heavy metals and buildup of nutrients. So, for example, phosphate would be buildup of nutrients, not so much nitrogen, but phosphates attached to those soil particles. By spreading it evenly out back over the land, we're taking it back to source. Also, if there is any heavy metals there or theoretically pollutants, it'll be evenly over the whole area, not just in a concentrated source on the site. Catch crops, which sequester nutrients. Sequester means retain and hold on to. So those cover crops are mopping up any nutrient that might have been left over from a crop. Catch crops are invariably also called cover crops, historically called cover crops. But any leftover nutrient from the previous crop, particularly nitrogen, those catch crops will mop up and hold on and be more likely to retain those nutrients, particularly over the winter and autumn. And it provides good ground cover for exposed soil. So once again, stops that raindrop damage from raindrops. Buffer strips and strip cropping. So, buffer strips between crops, or around the edges of crops. This is the bottom photograph here is a biodiversity planting, perennial planting in Pukekohe. Now that's right behind that is an open drain. So in this case, it's a good buffer for everything really, for nutrients moving towards the
drain. Hopefully those perennial crops will suck up that bit of nitrogen before it can make its way to the drain. Also, if you look there, if you were to make a mistake with spreading fertilizer and a Vicon just spreader out the back, that would actually be a good barrier just from the foliage alone, if someone made a mistake, of a good physical barrier. That planting also, because it's a diverse planting, is a really good source of biodiversity and beneficial insects. To lower, the idea here is to lower the use of insecticides in the adjoining vegetable crops. So it's got a multiple uses. You can see an example, the top example there, where they've got areas between cropped areas as a green planting or manure crop for the next rotation. So cover crops also mitigate exposure, erosion. Obviously, all those fine roots are holding onto soil particles, and they're less likely, even if they're caught up in a flood, to be removed or moved further down into the property. Cover crops are really good improving organic matter and soil biology. The organic matter, though, takes a long time to build up organic matter with cover crops. I think we discussed this in the first session. There's not as much dry matter being returned to the crop as people think, but certainly the benefit of never having a exposed area of soil is incredibly beneficial. Just growing cover crops for those roots to break up and exploit the soil, once those roots die, there's good pathways for water and air to get down through the soil, and increases the biological activity of, there's something living in the soil the whole time, compared to a bare patch of soil which is exposed and really a lot of potential damage from raindrops, and also just from people don't like a weedy area of paddock or block, so they'll just go and cultivate to make it look tidy. Also, people can use legumes to fix nitrogen. So you've got legumes like peas, beans, clover, which fix nitrospheric nitrogen, where we can see little bacteria nodules on the roots of legumes that symbiotically are associated with legumes and fix that nitrogen from the atmosphere. And then we get this passive die-off of these roots and use of the nitrogen either in the crop that's growing there or subsequent crops.
Do you normally see cover crops like that in orchards?
That's a good question, and I was going to ask you guys that question actually.
Well, I'm still learning getting around hort industry, so I defer to the experts.
Okay, so
I haven't seen it that much so far.
Well, Norman's got a bit of experience with understory plantings. Yeah. So my question is, in that top right-hand picture of kiwi fruit, where we've got a lot of leaf area, what do you think the effect is there? What do you think the effect?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a block of kiwi fruit that looks very much like that, although we do still have a weed spray strip. We try and spray it as little as possible. So we haven't seen actually any negative impact, and I guess we do pick up more beneficial insects, but it's a way to we try and side throw mow as well, so it does provide a cover, especially in the kiwi fruit, because it can be quite dark when you have a full canopy. So we're experimenting with species just to see what's going to keep coming back, and just a different management strategy. So we mow high. We never Unless we need to do a mulch, we'll just try and mow a little bit higher or side throw mow. Just to try and get as much organic matter back into the weed spray strip. Same with a couple of our apple blocks where we've done similar as well. And the species that we've put in, there's a lot of clovers, plantain, even a few little brassicas and bits and pieces as well. So a mix of things that provide organic matter and deeper tap roots and nitrogen fixing, into different management strategy. So.
Did within that block, Norman, did you have any untreated areas?
What do you mean untreated?
Well, it'd be really interesting to do a replicated trial and do some bays where you had conventional herbicides and whatnot, where you.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. We do actually. We have put one block aside for the conventional fertilizer. Everything else is the same though. So we are doing a trial with Ag First, actually doing some monitoring of the soil, and the only difference, like I say, is the fertilizer regime. We have dropped our herbicide by 20%, and we put in a mix of a fish hydrolysate and a microbial mix as well to try and increase the uptake of the uptake of the herbicide, but reducing the quantity of herbicide that we're using.
Yep. It depends. My pet answer for this is depends on the crop, depends on the situation. My example is in India, I saw a guy who was growing organic apples, and he had a huge vigor problem. And he was so proud he was growing clover underneath these trees and saying, well, these are fixing nitrogen. You've got too much nitrogen going in these trees. You actually don't. Competition is actually potentially quite good because his vigor was so high, but you're actually feeding them nitrogen, which they actually don't want. But he just read somewhere that a legume was good, and without, once again, it's understanding systems.
Because the recommendation for our mix was also based on the same guy that does the fertilizer recommendation. So he's been really cutting back the nitrogen application per hectare each season, just to just to get to a point where we've got that balance. And it's also understanding, what's happening there, because it is a trial.
We did some work 3 or 4 years ago on Connor's property with what's it called? The government program something water. Anyway, 3 or 4 different soil types on this big block, all the same variety of apples, and basically we were looking at should we manage the water differently and the nutrients differently on the real light soil compared to the heavier soil at the other end. The problem with the heavy soil at one end was they get what they've got is too much vigor in the trees, poor fruit quality, low fruit color. We found on the interesting enough at the other end of the property where there was light soil, the trees were 50% less biomass. That's 50% less trunk and stems and stuff. Over a 3-year period, they were getting 30% greater yield on the trees, theoretically under more stress. Now, if you grew a cover crop under the heavy, at the other end of the block, where it was a very heavy soil, I think it would really help with the vigor. And these are dwarf rootstocks. So they've been designed over time to be in a herbicide system, if you like, with a herbicide understory, herbicide strip. So
funny enough, that block is we're supposed to this spring be ripping and re-sowing the inter-row, 2 out of the 3 rows. I mean, I guess it's going to depend a little bit on the weather, because like I say, it's pretty wet down there at the moment to be doing anything. So we'll see how we go with that one.
But if you did it at the other end on the house stones, Norman, these trees are low vigor now. They're settled. They're a lot there's no issues with them producing 30% more yield. If you were to put an understory planting instead of herbicide in those rows, I think they'd go backwards. They would have lower yield. So once again, it's understanding systems and crops and situations, which we're getting on. Anyway, better move on. Actually, we're starting to 4:45.
Just on the cover crops, obviously the wine industry is using more and more of those. Over the last few years, it's becoming commonplace.
And once again, you'd have to be careful. It's all about leaf area, really. If you have a lot of leaf area with your weeds or your species that you're growing there, or your cover crops or whatever, it's going to suck out a lot of more water. And we know that a lot of those grape roots will be optimally, they want to extract water and nutrients out of that top 30 odd centimeters of soil. And if you've got all the cover crop in the herbicide strip, what mainly I'm talking about, in the herbicide strip, that's also competing in that. So there's a reason why we have herbicide strips, I suppose is what I'm saying, is you got to be careful about the competition. And it's horses for courses, really. Right, riparian plantings. We've seen a lot of this in all our areas, I'm sure, going in over the last few years. So it's really about planting that. Generally, it's 5 meters is the risk zone on each side of a waterway. But if it's really dependent on rainfall, soil type, topography. Once again, if we have anything greater than a 1 degree slope, this planting we see, this fairly narrow planting here on the riparian strip, its benefits are going to be challenged if you have a slope going down to it. But if we look at a situation like this, it's a huge step forward compared to what we used to be, which was basically stock could go and wander through the river. So it's a huge change. Councils have lots of resources to tap into. What else? You've seen a lot of riparian plantings now down in Canterbury?
Yeah. I mean, the dairy industry has been quite proactive in getting stock out of waterways and put riparian planting in for a long time. What we're also seeing is with the centre pivots, there was a lot of, I suppose, shelter belts that were planted potentially under subsidies in the 60s and 70s to protect against erosion and the winds. They've sort of all been taken out, and so there's quite a bit of planting under irrigators now that's very much like riparian planting, with the natives and the bits and pieces. So yeah, no, I think that there's a lot more happening down here.
Yeah, good. Now this is from Taurunga's presentation, and I'll skip these two. Oh, it's not letting me. Okay, I think this is a very interesting slide here, and it's showing us minimal tillage. So every time we cultivate a block, we accelerate the decomposition of organic matter. We're basically destroying structure, that nice friable aggregation of particles into clumps, and lots of a good soil structure has lots of macro and micro pores and channels going down through it. So, but when we cultivate, we tend to, we like a nice fine tilth for sowing seeds, etc. But in the process, we're actually breaking down soil structure, and we're getting decomposition of organic matter and mineralization. We're accelerating the mineralization or the availability of nutrients, particularly the nitrous, phosphorus, and potassium, and all the nutrients that are bound up in organic matter. So more and more we've moved to either minimum tillage or nil tillage. And so we can see the situation here where this crop, it looks like, what is it, corn or something, has been drilled into the cereal. The cereal's just been harvested, and it doesn't look to me like it's been herbicided. It looks like it's just been drilled into it. So we're getting minimal disturbance of the soil. Here we can see it's been drilled through the trash. It does take a special type of drill to do this. Traditional drills generally can't do this. Once again, though, there is greater risks, so you must understand the system. One of the things that cultivation does is it really reduces the population of things like slugs and snails and other predators of seed, if you like. So when they do this, they have to keep have a much better understanding of life cycles and identification of potentially harmful insects and whatnot. So, and potentially more use of insecticides and slug baits, etc., because these nasties haven't been damaged or eliminated in the soil cultivation process. Mulches. So once again, we've talked about my big thing about no one ever talks about the impact of rain on soils. It does a huge amount of damage, rain on an unprotected soil. Any idea what speed a raindrop travels at? Anyone got any idea?
I don't know, 100k an hour. I don't know.
Well, I always go on about the speed of raindrops, so today I thought I'd actually look it up. And it's 9 meters per second, or 20 miles per hour, which is 30-something kilometers an hour. So every raindrop is traveling that speed, and you can imagine what damage it's doing when it hits an unprotected bit of soil particle. It's absolutely smashing them. So you can imagine a fallow block of land on a vegetable farm that's sitting out in the middle of winter, that's getting rained on for 6 or 8 weeks. The damage that's being done to the soil structure. And I've walked on soils that have been in long-term cultivation, and when it dries out a bit, you're walking over it, it's just like concrete. I was gobsmacked one day and walking on a vegetable block, and it was just after winter, and there was a little clod of soil that was about, 3 or 4 inches high, and I stood on top of it, and it was just like concrete. Amazing. And for them to then, it just is a never-ending cycle. For them to be able to then use that block, they've got to hammer the hell out of it with cultivators and rotary hose and stuff to get it into a state where they can plant it again. Whereas a block with a good soil structure would need minimal cultivation. So mulches also help retain moisture and provide nutrients as they break down. So over time, theoretically, less inputs are required. So we get, as those mulches break down, they'll provide some nutrients. The best mulches, if you're just trying to retain soil, soil structure, soil moisture, inhibit weed growth, are mulches, of course, that don't break down. So then we see these bark type products which have a large surface area. They're not going to break down easily. Historically, things like straw, pea straw and whatnot, they're not breaking down because they've got a lot of carbon. They need some nitrogen to break down. And this is the other thing we have to be careful with mulches, particularly things like sawdust, which has is less surface area. It's smaller particles compared to the bark ones. These have better, say something like sawdust has a better contact with the soil, and it will actually rob the nitrogen, any nitrogen that's available. It'll want to try and use it to break down. The microbes need that nitrogen to help them break down the cellulose and the high carbon in the mulch. So that's something we just have to watch for and understand. Rotational cropping, like we talked before, the main reason for rotating crops is for disease control. But then we get these other benefits. So, not all soil exposed at any one time. If we can keep cover crops, rotational cropping and cover crops going, it'll minimize the exposure to the soil surface to the rain. Different crops access nutrients differently. We've got some plants that'll have very deep rooting and some plants are very shallow. Your leafy greens, very shallow rooting depth, compared to, say, something like a brassica, which are much deeper. Can reduce soil compaction, can improve soil organic matter, can lessen inputs required, improve nutrient cycling. Cultivation. Very dependent on soil moisture content of a soil. If we cultivate when it's either too dry or too wet, we can do significant harm to soil structure. When it's too dry, it absolutely pulverizes the soil structure. When it's too wet, we just push and mold the soil together and push out any air pockets in the soil. And when it dries, it sort of dries structureless. So if you look, it's hard to see in this photograph of this tractor, but this is wheel track ripping and diking. They've got these molds that, as they're going down the row, create these little molds that the mold plow tips over and creates these little pockets going down the wheel rut. And if you're on a sloping soil, say in Pukekohe, what that does is slow the water movement going down the wheel track. It slows the water down so we don't get this trenching and erosion going on. Another one that's becoming popular now is strip cropping, where they will only cultivate the area directly underneath the planted row, where the inter-row is not cultivated. That's becoming quite popular now and been quite successful too. And of course, not cultivating out to the margins, leaving that riparian, a bit of riparian area, or grassed area around the edges of cultivated blocks. Detainment bunds. The whole idea is to slow down the movement of water and get it to dump out the small particles while it's within your own block. So anything to trap sediment within your block and reduce the potential for the sediment to run off and take the phosphorus with it. Also, these settlement areas or ponds can act as denitrification. Denitrification is where you get aerobic conditions, and the nitrate in the water or in that environment can be gassed off as what's called nitric oxide. So nitrate turns into this other form of nitrogen gas, if you like, and it's just gassed off into the environment rather than leaching. of different forms of sediment traps. We've talked about the temporary ones, and then, well, basically anything that can buffer a block with vegetation or different types of plants to be a bit of a buffer for the sediment, or to slow down the movement of water and trap the sediment within that block. So yeah, we've just saw that video on wetland, creating a wetland, and more and more effort is being put around to retain wetlands or to return areas to wetland. So one of the processes used to try and remove nitrogen before it enters some of these waterways, or in some cases, I'll talk about in a minute, when water waste is put back on the land, is bioreactors. And basically it's using nitrogen to denitrify, nitrogen utilizing bacteria to convert the nitrate into nitrate gas, rather than the nitrate carrying on through into the waterway. That nitrate gas is then gassed off into the environment, into the air. So yeah, they can inoculate certain bacteria into the wood chips to do this process. I don't know many of these, or any, if any actually, processes in our area, but we were involved, or Greg in our office was involved within the last year of a project to do with a winery in Marlborough, where they were looking at what sort of our wastewater from the winery, how do we dispose of it? What sort of area do we need to irrigate back onto that isn't a risk to the environment? So they looked at nutrient levels of the wastewater, and what they had to pre-treat for was nitrogen and potassium to reduce some of those levels. And then they irrigated that water back onto a known area, and were able to calculate how big that area needed to be to distribute that wastewater on. Stream banks, high water flow, that high energy can erode stream banks of streams and overflow and enter production areas, which is what we're seeing here in the upper Motueka River at the moment, Motueka Valley. And some of the mitigations, of course, is groins and rock boulder reinforcing. You can see examples of it here. We also see these on coastline, of course. But yeah, bolstering some of those areas on the river edges which are taking the most energy. Use of drains and culverts and bunds, controlling the water where you've defined it needs to go. But once again, trying to drop out the sediment within your own property bounds. Irrigation, really important that we know what we're applying, we know our soil type, we know how much it can hold, how are we monitoring it, what we talked about this last time, what is the field capacity. We can only do this with monitoring equipment. It's very hard to determine it from above the soil, so we need to monitor what's happening below the soil. And so our whole scheduling of irrigation of how often and how much is based around monitoring what's happening in the soil. Where are we? How far are we from a stress point? When do we need to irrigate? Just a few more slides, guys. Nutrient discharges from greenhouses. They discharge the water from hydroponics. When the salt levels in the nutrient solution get out of hand, certain nutrients are taken up more than other nutrients, and they can get out of whack. So the greenhouse is forced then to dump that nutrient solution that is normally just recirculating out throughout the greenhouse, getting topped up with nutrient and then recirculating. But there comes times when they just have to dump it. So it's like my previous comments around the grape washing discharge to land, same sort of thing. They need to, a greenhouse needs to generally have 2 weeks of storage of this water over winter and 1 week's worth of storage in the summer. Saying, right, you've got to have a certain amount of storage, and then when the ideal conditions are good, i.e. not high rainfall, we will then irrigate it over to a known area and spray it on that area evenly. And there's all code of practice around this, and the whole process is quite well documented in the greenhouse nutrient discharge code of practice. Same with vegetable washing. In a vegetable operation, a lot of water is used to wash the vegetables. So same sort of thing. They have storage areas that are should be impervious to store that water, and then discharge back to land at the appropriate rate. Once again, there's a code of practice. All these codes of practice are on the Hort NZ site. And that's an example of what we call a soil aquifer treatment system, where they'll actually create this environment where soil profile where they're actually putting the treated water through, and with a known outcome under certain conditions, unsaturated conditions, they'll know that it's safe. The water finally making it to the aquifer, it will be safe, and it's been filtered down through their treated area, where they've created a soil profile to actually filter that solution. And once again, there's an example of the discharge code of practice. But ultimately, as we at the start of this, we talked to Joss about his record keeping around soil testing. We see this time and time again nowadays amongst our more sophisticated operations, is very good record keeping of everything that we've been talking about today. And it's really good to see as our businesses become more and more professional. Right, we've overshot our time now, so thank you for your attendance. Any questions? All good?
All good, I think.
Tired of listening to me.
No, all good. Thanks, Mike. It's another good session.
Mm.
Okay.